Sawdust and Sweat by Rock Jane. Chapter 1. Elena Moretti stood at the edge of the driveway, staring up at the mansion she had just signed her future over to. The house loomed like a faded queen, regal even beneath years of neglect. Arched windows stared back at her like tired eyes. The wrought iron balconies sagged, rust gnawing at their beauty. The roof tiles were chipped, ivy clung to cracked walls, and every inch of the place whispered of a glory long gone. It was everything she had wanted, and everything she was terrified of. Elena shoved her hands into the pockets of her linen blazer, breathing in the late spring air of the Hudson Valley. This house wasn't just a project, it was her dream. She had poured her savings, her bonus, and even her rainy day fund into purchasing the Italianate estate. For years, she'd pictured herself restoring a historic home, not some sterile condo with stainless steel appliances. Something that had bones, something that had soul. But dreams, as she was learning, came with cracked plaster, leaking pipes, and floorboards that moaned like ghosts. She heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A black pickup truck pulled into the drive, dust swirling in its wake. Out stepped the man she'd been told was the best contractor in the county, Luca Romano. The name alone had rolled off the realtor's tongue like a secret. He's expensive, but worth it. He knows these old houses better than anyone. Elena straightened as he approached, boots sinking into gravel, his tool belt slung low on his hips. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered, his t-shirt clinging to muscle that looked carved from stone. His forearms were dusted with sawdust, as though he carried his work everywhere with him. Dark hair curled just enough to look unruly, and when he lifted his head, his eyes caught hers with startling intensity. For a second, Elena forgot her rehearsed greeting, forgot the speech she'd prepared about budgets and deadlines, forgot her own name. He extended a hand. "Ms. Moretti?" His voice was low, roughened with a faint Italian lilt that made her pulse trip. She placed her palm against his. His grip was firm, warm, lingering just a fraction too long. A flicker of awareness shot up her arm and settled inconveniently in her chest. "Elena," she corrected softly, almost against her better judgment. "Please, call me Elena." His mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something that carried weight. "Then Elena it is." The air between them tightened, the silence suddenly louder than the rustle of trees or the chirp of cicadas. She pulled her hand back, trying to remember she was a client and he was, well, temptation wrapped in sweat and calluses. "Shall we?" he asked, nodding toward the front door. Elena exhaled and pushed the heavy door open, letting him step into her crumbling dream. The scent of dust and disuse filled the entryway, sunlight slanting across faded tiles. She followed him inside, bracing herself, not for the renovation, for the man who had just walked into her life. Chapter 2. The foyer groaned as they stepped inside, dust dancing in the slanted light. Elena's heels clicked against the cracked marble tiles, while Luca's boots thudded with steady confidence. He glanced around, eyes sharp, absorbing every detail the way a painter studies a blank canvas. "You weren't kidding," he murmured, running his hand along the banister of the grand staircase. The wood was scarred, the finish worn, but his fingers traced it with something like reverence. Solid walnut. They don't make them like this anymore. "You sound almost sentimental," Elena said, watching him more than the wood. "I am," he replied simply, crouching to inspect a missing spindle. "When you work with your hands long enough, you start to respect what lasts." She tilted her head, studying the broad line of his shoulders as he worked. His shirt stretched across muscle in a way that should have been illegal in broad daylight. She forced her eyes to the peeling ceiling instead. "This house has lasted a century and a half," she said lightly. "I'd like it to last another." He rose and faced her, dark eyes steady. "Then you've come to the right man." Her breath hitched, the words hitting with more weight than they should. It was business. He meant the house. Of course he did. Still, heat prickled at the back of her neck. They moved room to room, Luca pointing out structural issues, Elena pretending to listen while her thoughts drifted far from beams and joists. "Here," he said, stepping into the parlor. "The plaster's crumbling. Needs a full strip and redo. And those windows. Beautiful, but drafty as hell." Elena leaned against the doorway, folding her arms. Drafty I can live with. I like a little imperfection. His gaze flicked to her, sharp and assessing, as though he was weighing whether she meant more than she said. For a moment, silence hummed, thick with something unspoken. He broke it by kneeling to check the floorboards. These will need replacing. She crouched too, careful of her skirt. Can they be saved? He looked up, their faces suddenly close, the faint scent of cedar and sawdust clinging to him. Maybe. Depends how much care you're willing to put in. Her heartbeat stumbled. Care. The word lingered between them like an invitation. She straightened too quickly, brushing invisible dust from her thigh. I'm not afraid of putting in the work. His smile was small but knowing, as if he'd read the double meaning she hadn't intended to give away. They moved to the dining room, then the kitchen, where the old farmhouse sink leaned against a sagging counter. Luca set his hands on the porcelain, fingers spread wide, rough and capable. Elena found herself staring, imagining those same hands on. She snapped her gaze away. So, how long will it take? She asked too quickly. Didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, crossing his arms over his chest. The posture was casual, but it radiated a kind of command, like the house already belonged to him. That depends, he said finally, his voice low, deliberate. On how much you're willing to trust me. The words landed heavy, settling. Somewhere deep inside her, this was supposed to be about a house, about contracts and blueprints. But Elena couldn't shake the feeling that Luca Romano wasn't just talking about plaster and nails. Chapter 3. The renovation began in earnest a week later, and with it, Elena's carefully constructed sense of control began to crumble like the plaster walls. Every morning, Luca's truck would rumble up the drive, sending a thrill through her chest she refused to acknowledge. By noon, the house was alive with the thrum of saws and the rhythm of hammers, the air scented with wood, dust, and sweat. She told herself she visited the site daily to monitor progress, but the truth was more complicated. She wanted to see him. 1. Afternoon, Elena arrived just as he was carrying a beam across the hall. The weight looked tremendous, but he moved as if it were nothing, muscles flexing beneath his shirt. A fine sheen of sweat clung to his neck, catching the sunlight. Need a hand? She teased, though her voice betrayed her with a tremor. He shot her a look, half smirk, half challenge. Unless you can bench 200 pounds, I've got it. She leaned against the doorway, feigning nonchalance. Don't underestimate me. I've been known to surprise people. He set the beam down with a thud, stepping closer. I don't underestimate you, Elena. His tone was steady, but his eyes burned with something she couldn't quite name. She swallowed, heat crawling over her skin, before quickly changing the subject. Do you need water? I brought some. He took the bottle she offered, tilting it back, his throat working as he drank. Her gaze betrayed her, caught on the way his lips wrapped around the plastic, the flex of his jaw. She shifted, flustered, and his eyes flicked to hers knowingly as he lowered the bottle. Thanks, he murmured. The charged silence that followed was interrupted by a shower of dust drifting from the exposed ceiling. A clump landed in her hair. She brushed at it, but only made a bigger mess. Luca's hand reached out before she could protest, fingers combing gently through her hair, shaking free the dust. His touch lingered longer than necessary. You'll ruin that blazer if you keep walking around here, he said, voice low. She forced a laugh, though her pulse was thundering. Then maybe I need a wardrobe overhaul. His lips quirked. Or maybe you just need someone to keep you out of trouble. The words clung between them, heavier than casual banter. Elena stepped back, trying to steady her breath, but the encounters only grew more charged with each passing day. He'd brush past her in the narrow hall, his arm grazing hers, leaving sparks in his wake. She'd find herself watching the play of muscle as he bent to lift something, or the concentration in his brow as he studied the blueprints. And always, always, there was the undercurrent of what they weren't saying. One evening, as the sun dipped low, she found herself laughing at something he muttered about the house having more secrets than a priest. The sound caught her, off guard, light, unguarded. You're enjoying this, he said, eyes locked on hers. Maybe, she admitted, a little too softly. And in that moment, she wasn't sure if he meant the house or him. Chapter 4. The night it happened, Elena hadn't meant to stay so late. The contractors had left hours ago, the house quiet except for the faint hum of a work lamp. She lingered in the parlor, papers spread across the table, floor plans, budget notes, lists of decisions she hadn't yet made. But truthfully, she wasn't thinking about crown molding or tile. She was thinking about Luca. The sound of footsteps startled her. She looked up to see him entering from the hall, his shirt clinging to him, dust smudged across his forearm. A faint shadow of stubble darkened his jaw. "You're still here?" he said, his voice low, rough with the kind of fatigue that carried an edge of intimacy. "I could say the same about you." He shrugged, setting his tool bag down. Blueprints don't study themselves. He moved toward the table, his presence filling the room like another heartbeat. Elena tried to focus on the plans, but every nerve in her body tuned itself to him. He leaned over the table, pointing at a sketch, the heat of his body brushing close to hers. "You'll need to decide whether you want to keep this wall," he murmured, tapping the paper. Her hand shifted, brushing against his. The contact was accidental, at least it should have been, but neither of them moved. The rough pad of his thumb grazed her skin, slow, deliberate. The silence thickened, pressing down around them. Elena looked up and their eyes locked. It wasn't, just attraction. It was hunger, raw and unfiltered. She drew in a shaky breath. "Luca." Her name broke on his lips like a growl. Then his mouth was on hers. The kiss wasn't tentative. It was fierce, claiming, as if all the restraint of the past weeks had shattered in an instant. He pulled her closer, his hands rough against her waist, tugging her flush against the solid wall of his chest. Elena gasped, then surrendered. Her fingers tangling in his hair, her body arching toward him like she'd been waiting her entire life for this exact moment. He pressed her back against the exposed brick wall, the cool surface biting through her blouse while his heat consumed her. His hands mapped her curves with a builder's certainty, as if he'd known her body long before he ever touched it. When they finally broke apart for air, his forehead rested against hers, breaths ragged. "This is a mistake," he rasped, though his hands betrayed him, gripping her hips tighter. "Then why does it feel," she gasped, swallowing hard, "like the only thing that makes sense?" His eyes blazed, torn between reason and desire. But reason was already buried beneath the sawdust and sweat of weeks of temptation. He kissed her again, harder this time, and she knew, whatever walls she'd built around her heart, he was tearing them down brick by brick. Chapter 5. The kiss deepened until Elena couldn't tell where she ended, and Luca began. His hands roamed with a hunger that made her pulse stutter, dragging her tighter against him. She felt the rough scrape of calluses through the thin fabric of her blouse, the heat of his body searing into her own. She should have stopped, reminded him and herself that this was business. That lines existed for a reason. But then his mouth traced down her jaw, his breath hot against her throat, and every coherent thought crumbled like the plaster walls above them. "God, Elena," he groaned, his voice hoarse as if he'd been holding her name on his tongue for weeks. She tugged him closer, fingers curling into the hem of his shirt, desperate to feel more. The fabric bunched in her hands as her palms skimmed over the ridges of his stomach. He hissed in a breath, eyes darkening as he searched her face. "Tell me to stop," he said, though his lips hovered a breath away from hers. "Please, if you want me to, tell me." Her answer was a shake of the head, her whisper raw. "Don't stop." That was all he needed. With a low growl, he lifted her, pressing her against the scaffolding in the corner of the room. Her gasp echoed in the half-empty space, mingling with the hum of the work light. Sawdust clung to the air, dusting her hair, her clothes, but she didn't care. All she cared about was the man pinning her there, like she was the foundation he needed to keep standing. Her legs wrapped around his hips instinctively. His hands slid up her thighs, gripping firmly, grounding her and setting her on fire all at once. He kissed her again, urgent and consuming, until she thought her lungs might give out. Her dress bunched high around her waist, his rough palms exploring skin that hadn't been touched in far too long. Every brush of his fingers felt like sparks catching dry timber, setting her ablaze. "Luca," she whispered, half a plea, half a prayer. "I've wanted you since the first day." He groaned against her skin, his mouth moving down the curve of her neck. walking into this house and seeing you. I've been fighting it ever since." Her heart slammed against her ribs, not just from desire, but from the truth in his voice. She clutched at his shoulders, her nails digging in as he pressed against her, filling every space between them with raw need. The half-renovated room disappeared. There were no cracked walls, no broken tiles, no blueprints waiting on the table. There was only him, his strength, his heat, his breath tangled with hers as their restraint disintegrated completely. When he finally entered her, the world tilted. Her gasp turned into a cry, swallowed by his kiss as he moved with a desperate rhythm, as though each thrust was a promise he couldn't put into words. The scaffolding creaked, the old house bearing witness to the reckless, breathless union that neither of them could deny any longer. And when release tore through her, it wasn't just her body unraveling, it was every wall she had ever built around her heart. Chapter 6. For a long while, neither of them moved. Their ragged breaths filled the cavernous space, echoing off the bare walls. The scaffolding groaned. In protest beneath them, sawdust floating lazily in the golden beam of the work lamp. Elena pressed her forehead to Luca's shoulder, her chest rising and falling against his. Every nerve in her body still hummed with the aftermath, her skin tingling as though his touch had marked her permanently. Slowly, he eased her back to the ground, his hands steady on her waist as though he was reluctant to let go. She smoothed, her dress down, her legs still trembling, while he stood close enough that the warmth of his body anchored her. Neither spoke at first. The silence was intimate, not awkward, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. Finally, Luca exhaled, raking a hand through his disheveled hair. "I wasn't supposed to let that happen." Elena looked up, catching the raw honesty in his eyes. "Do you regret it?" He hesitated, then shook his head slowly. "No. I couldn't stop even if I tried." His gaze softened, as though he was seeing her, not just her body, but something beneath it. "I've wanted you since the first moment." Her lips parted, her throat tightening. The truth of it resonated because she had felt it too. That instant spark, that dangerous pull she'd tried to rationalize away. She stepped closer, touching his arm lightly. "Then don't stop now. Don't pretend like this isn't real." For the first time since she'd met him, his steady composure slipped. He leaned back against the table, eyes shadowed. "You don't understand. This, what I do, it's all I have. I build because it's in my blood. My father was a mason back in Italy. He taught me the trade when I was just a boy. Every brick I lay, every beam I raise, it's me honoring him. If I let anything jeopardize that..." He trailed off, shaking his head. Elena's chest tightened at the vulnerability in his voice. This man who carried beams as if they weighed nothing, who spoke in steady commands and worked with tireless hands, now looked almost fragile. She reached for him, curling her fingers around his rough hand. "You're not jeopardizing anything. Luca, you're building more than walls here." He met her eyes, searching for something he couldn't name. For once, she didn't flinch away. "I always dreamed of restoring a home like this," she confessed softly. "Not just because it's beautiful, but because maybe if I could put something broken back together, I'd feel less broken myself." The admission slipped out before she could stop it. Heat rushed to her cheeks, but she didn't take it back. Luca's hand tightened on hers, his thumb brushing, her knuckles with surprising tenderness. "You're not broken, Elena. You're stronger than you think. I see it every time you walk through this place." Her breath hitched, emotion knotting in her throat. For the first time in years, she felt seen. Not for her success, not for her control, but for the pieces she tried to hide. And in his gaze, she realized it wasn't just lust pulling them together anymore. It was something far deeper. Chapter 7. For a time, everything moved in a delicate balance. Days were filled with the noise of progress. Walls coming down, new beams going up, light pouring into spaces that had been shut away for decades. But beneath the dust and plaster, Elena and Luca carried a secret no one else on the site could. See? A glance that lingered too long. A brush of fingers when exchanging blueprints. A silent promise in the way their eyes met across a room. It was intoxicating. It was dangerous. Then the delay hit. Luca stood in the dining room, jaw set as he held his phone to his ear. Elena watched from the doorway, the tension in his body making the air feel heavier. When he ended the call, he muttered something under his breath in Italian. "What is it?" Elena asked carefully. He dragged a hand over his face. "The flooring. Shipment. It's stuck in customs. Could be weeks before it clears." Her stomach dipped. "Weeks?" "Yeah." He exhaled sharply, pacing a few steps. "I've got another client breathing down my neck. Investors watching the clock. A delay like this, it puts my reputation at risk." Elena moved closer, instinctively reaching for him, but he stiffened, as though bracing against her comfort. "We'll figure it out," she said gently. His eyes snapped to hers, frustration sparking. "This isn't just about figuring it out. I can't afford distractions right now." The word cut sharper than she expected. Distractions. Was that what he thought of her? She folded her arms, defensive. "If you're calling me a distraction, I'm calling this a problem." His voice was low, firm, though his eyes betrayed conflict. "You and me, whatever this is, it complicates things." The sting of his words hit harder than she wanted to admit. She turned away, staring at the cracked plaster on the wall as if it were suddenly fascinating. "You knew it complicated things from the beginning. Yet you kissed me. You touched me. Don't you dare act like I'm the only one who wanted this." Sighed, raking a hand through his hair, looking suddenly tired. "Elena." "No," she said, whirling back to face him. Her heart pounded, fury and hurt tangled together. "You don't get to make me feel like I'm some mistake just because you're scared. Passion this strong doesn't just vanish because the schedule got messy." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. His jaw flexed, his eyes dark with something unspoken, desire, fear, guilt. Then he turned away, grabbing his tool, bag. "I need to clear my head." And just like that, he was gone, leaving Elena in the half-renovated dining room, surrounded by dust and unfinished walls that felt far too much like her own heart. Chapter 8. The days that followed were suffocating. Luca kept his distance, throwing himself into the work with mechanical focus. He spoke only when necessary, about measurements, schedules, supplies. His voice was clipped, his eyes avoiding hers. Elena endured it for as long as she could, but with every silence, every cold nod, her frustration grew into something unbearable. Finally, one evening, she stayed behind after the crew left. She waited for him in the parlor, the faint glow of the setting sun bleeding through the tall windows. When he appeared, surprise flickered across his face. "Elena, no." Her voice cut sharper than she intended. She stepped forward, fire in her chest. "I'm done pretending this doesn't matter. I'm done letting you act like I'm a distraction you need to shake off." His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. "You want to pull away? Fine. But I need you to admit something first." Her hands trembled, but she kept her chin high. "Admit that when you touch me, it feels real. Admit that you've thought about me when you're not supposed to. Admit that this isn't just lust in a half-finished house." The silence between them was a living thing, pressing in on her ribs. Luca's eyes burned, his control unraveling by the second. At last, he moved, crossing the room in 2 long strides and cupping her face in his rough, dust-stained hands. "I've thought about you every damn day," he growled. "Every night I close my eyes. It's you I see. And it terrifies me, Elena, because I can build anything except a future I can promise you." Her breath caught. His confession cracked something open inside her, fragile and glowing. She placed her hands over his, steadying them against her cheeks. "Then stop fighting it," she whispered. "We'll figure the rest out later." "Right. Now, I just want this. I want you." For a heartbeat, he looked like he might argue. But then he bent, kissing her with a hunger that obliterated the distance they'd tried to enforce. This kiss was different. Slower, deeper, threaded with tenderness beneath the heat. He guided her into the dining room, where candles flickered on the unfinished mantel, their light casting gold across the half-plastered walls. She hadn't lit them. He had. At some point, he had prepared for this, no matter how much he'd tried to deny it. They sank onto a blanket he'd spread across the floor, the cool hardwood beneath them, the soft glow of moonlight spilling through the arched windows above. This time, there was no frantic tearing away, no reckless urgency. He undressed her with reverence, each brush of his hands a promise. She traced the lines of his chest, the scars of his labor, marveling at the man who carried both strength and vulnerability in equal measure. When he entered her, it was unhurried, their breaths mingling as they moved together in rhythm. The world beyond the room ceased to exist. The creak of scaffolding, the smell of sawdust, the weight of unfinished walls, none of it mattered. Because here, in the glow of flickering candles and the steady heat of his touch, Elena realized she wasn't just falling for him. She already had. Chapter 9. The weeks that followed felt different. The flooring finally arrived, delays resolved, and the work surged forward with renewed energy. Walls were finished, windows restored, paint brushed across rooms that once looked like ruins. The Italianate mansion began to shine again, not just as a structure, but as something reborn. And through it all, Elena and Luca moved as though they shared a secret rhythm. Their touches were subtler now, their smiles private, but the bond between them only deepened, layered like the house itself. Foundation, beam, brick, and soul. When the final day came, Elena stood at the center of the foyer, staring up at the chandelier now blazing with golden light. The cracked marble beneath her heels gleamed, polished back to life. Her dream had taken shape before her eyes. Luca stepped beside her, his expression unreadable. "She's beautiful again," he said, his voice carrying a quiet pride. Elena looked at him, warmth spreading through her chest. "So are you," she wanted to say. Instead, she whispered, "Thank you." He gave a small nod, his hand brushing hers as though by accident. But she caught his fingers, holding them firmly. "This house," she murmured, "wasn't the only thing you restored." His eyes softened, the walls around him falling one by one. And in that silence, the truth settled between them. This wasn't just about sawdust and sweat. This was about love. Messy, unplanned, but stronger than either of them had expected. That night, after the last worker left and the house finally belonged to her alone, Elena opened a bottle of red wine and waited. Luca arrived without knocking. He found her in the parlor, candles lit along the mantel, shadows dancing across the freshly painted walls. "Thought you might want to christen the place?" he said, voice low, roughened by desire he didn't bother to hide. Her laugh was soft, nervous, thrilled. "You mean, celebrate?" Something like that. They barely made it to the staircase before his mouth was on hers, urgent and claiming. She laughed against his lips, tugging him upward, heels clattering against the polished wood. They stumbled into the master bedroom, still faintly scented with new paint and cedar. There, under the sweep of the restored arch ceiling, they came together with wild abandon. This wasn't the slow tenderness of their candlelit night, nor the reckless urgency of their first union. It was both, fierce and unrestrained, threaded with devotion, clothes scattered across the gleaming floor. Their laughter tangled with gasps and groans. Every kiss, every touch was a celebration, a marking of territory. This was their house now, every room a witness to the fire they carried when at last they collapsed together on the wide bed, breathless. And sated, Elena knew the house wasn't just walls and windows anymore. It was a home, and within it, she had found something she hadn't dared to dream of. Love that was built to last.